May I begin by thanking you, Secretary of State. I know, and all of you, for your evidence today, and I think it's incredibly welcome that you're all supportive of amends and strengthening this bill, because I think that's very much come through in our witness statements. I think on the mental health side, which I know I've seen firsthand the brilliant work you've done around mental health and your passion for it, one of the things that has come through in our witness statements, in particular from Martin Lewis from Money Saving Experts, was the risk of scam ads. And also in relation to that, the fact that at the moment you could do user-generated content which is harmful, which would be covered by this bill, but you could, if it got pulled, you could do the same content but put 10 quid behind it and it would be an ad and it wouldn't be covered by this bill. And so I just wondered if you could explain, firstly, why advertising hasn't been included, online advertising, and secondly, if there's scope for us to make suggestions around that within this bill, please.
So I'm going to hand over to Minister Hinds for that, but I'm just going to make a number of points. I did say this is not the fix the everything on the internet bill, and also that we do need to focus on protecting children, illegal content and legal but harmful content. That has to be our tight scope on this bill. And so we can't fix everything. But we are doing work on online advertising. That is happening. And I think that what you talk about is so important that it actually needs a bill of its own. And because I think it would be lost within this bill, and I think it would widen the scope of this bill too much. I have full sympathy, but this is not the bill for that. But I'm going to hand over to Minister Hinds on that.
Thank you very much, Secretary of State, and Dean, thank you for bringing this up, because it's an incredibly important area. We've seen huge growth, of course, in fraud, and as other crime categories have been coming down for a long time, mercifully, I'm afraid some criminals have moved on to the internet. It's a different type of crime, distance crime. Typically, no witnesses can actually often be perpetrated from abroad. So it's a very different setup altogether. Now, of course, we did bring user-generated content fraud into scope of the bill, and that's very important for certain categories of fraud, like romance fraud, which is I think a particularly horrible type of fraud. But I am also very conscious of the role of paid advertising in other categories, particularly of fraud, and we need to bear down on it. The question is not whether we bear down on it, but how best to bear down on it, whether it's in this piece of legislation or elsewhere. But we are very, very alive to the need to move. I hear very frequently, regularly from the financial services sector, as well as from individuals from all of our constituents who we hear from depressingly often. About having been victims, or their parents having been victims of scams, as you rightly say, and so we do need to work more on it. The question is whether this is exactly the right vehicle, or something else is more appropriate.
Thank you. May I just expand on that very slightly? I appreciate that we don't want to catch all, and also that creates loopholes. And I must say, from the evidence we've had from the platforms, Facebook in particular, I have to say I was not particularly. I didn't come away from that feeling like they were going to do everything that they say that we need them to do. And I agree with comments of other colleagues that we shouldn't really need this bill, to be honest, but the fact we're having to force them down that route. And of course, their income comes from advertising. That's their sole area for that. So I just wonder whether, even if we can't put recommendations specific for the bill, would it be helpful for us to put together some thoughts about how perhaps other elements could play into aligning this bill with the need to protect people from scam ads? I don't know whether we're allowed to do that within our recommendations, but I just feel that there's such a quick shift from user-generated content to then being able to turn it into advertising for the same content with putting money behind it, that if we can't put it in this bill, that we could make recommendations how that could work in another form. I don't know, Chair, whether you'd be...
We're interested to see any recommendations, but can I just clarify as well on the fraud advertising element, that this bill will tackle user-generated advertising. For example, someone going onto Facebook and saying, join my Ponzi scheme. So if it's generated by a user on Facebook, then individuals, then it does apply. Okay. And it also applies to romance scams. So there's a lot of, as we've all read and we've all heard, some awful stories about what happens there. So it does also include those. So it doesn't exactly exclude advertising. It just includes the advertising that we know we can make work within the scope of this bill, so that this bill actually does what it's supposed to do, what it says on the front of the face of the bill. And in DCMS, we do have an online advertising programme which we're working on. And so any recommendations that you give to us in your report would go as part of the consideration of what we're doing on the online advertising programme. It wouldn't be wasted recommendations, it will be used. But as I said, I think the scam advertising is such a big piece of work in a bill. And I know that, I've worked with Martin Lewis before when I was in mental health. I think I had the wording of a letter that bailiffs send out to individual change so that it didn't cause distress. So I understand his intentions are always really, really thoughtful and genuine. But in the context of legal application, we have to be absolutely guaranteed that what we put in the bill works. And this bill and the scope of this bill is about protecting children, number one, illegal content, number two, and legal but harmful. We need to make those adverts illegal, and that needs to be, as the Minister said, its own piece of work in another department. But please bring your recommendations to us.
And Dean, just to add to that, I think if there is anything in this space, based on the evidence you've heard, which you think is really sort of targeted at a particular part of the advertising space, maybe in connection with fraud, that is very important and very urgent, but sort of self-contained and targeted, so it doesn't it's not too expansive, because that would run into the issues the Secretary of State laid out. I mean, do suggest it if you see something urgent, important and targeted.
And also be aware, we're not going to say no because we don't like it. We're not going to say no because we don't think it's, absolutely 100% sympathy with, the deep fake videos, the advertising, and absolutely, I'd love to include them in this bill. What Martin Lewis is campaigning on, I would love to put in here, but my legal advice is that it wouldn't work and it would extend the scope of the bill in a way which would not be appropriate and would not meet the objectives of a bill which protects children. That's the only reason I'm not including it, and it needs its own bill.
I understand. No, thank you. And
Chair, if I might. So to be clear, fraudulent advertising of scams is illegal, and it's illegal whether it happens on Facebook or it happens on a street corner. That remains the case. The question is about what's in sort of which piece of legislation. It's a big thing. I mean, I think, Chairman, your terms of reference are to do with what is in the bill and what you think should be in this bill.
Indeed.
So I think you are at liberty to say when you think something should be in this bill. I think what the Secretary of State is saying quite rightly is that we need to think about what's going to be most effective. And my overarching principle, I think, on this is that we need to align people's objectives. So, banks, for example, lose quite a lot of money on the back of having to recompense people for having been defrauded. As you, Dean, rightly identified, certain platforms make money out of advertising, which may, itself then be contributing to that defrauding. And so we need to make sure that everybody's incentives are the same to minimise these horrible acts, preying on people's. It's actually preying on vulnerable people. Actually, also preying on everyone like us. I mean, it's a crime that can and does go into every segment now of our society.
And if I may, just there's a couple of areas around that I'd like to go on, not around advertising, but around algorithms. I know we've talked about it earlier. One of the things that really has come through in the evidence to me as well has been the increased addictive nature of algorithms. And it seems to me, even though the witness from Facebook said that they have never attempted to create algorithms that are more addictive, we see that they are, and we see that especially on things like Instagram and TikTok and so on. One of the areas that there seems to be a massive gap is in the research or the publication of research into harms to children in particular, teenage girls in particular, but around things like dopamine levels in the brain and all of that. Now, these different platforms vary in their take on whether they've done research, whether they've got research. Is there anything within the scope of this bill where we could require them to publish any research they've done related to algorithms and the impact that's had on the psychology of children?
I don't know if we can compel people to publish research in this bill. I think that would extend the scope of the bill and be one of those kind of like those offshoots or side acts which would dilute the bill. And it's one of those things that would get debated in Parliament and it would just, I think it would be difficult. But you're absolutely right. There is research which is done, particularly into the effect on body image, on young girls, on anorexia. But there isn't enough, and I would certainly love the evidence on that, because that would just be more power to our elbow. But I think it's important to state again. People will say you're giving extraordinary powers to Ofcom, and the reason why we're giving them extraordinary powers is because of a fundamental question of algorithms lifting the lid on those, the platforms of the car, lifting the lid of the bonnet, getting underneath. The engine is the algorithms. We need to give Ofcom those powers in order to bust the myths around algorithms, to demand the transparency on algorithms and what platforms are using. They hide behind smoke and mirrors. They literally hide behind. They look at you and say one thing, and behind the mirror, there's something else going on. We know that. We know that for a fact. You've taken evidence on that yourself, and so that's why Ofcom need those powers. I hope as a result of this, it will instigate, once we get more evidence on the algorithms, once we have more information, maybe that in itself will stimulate more research into the impact of those algorithms.
And hopefully perhaps the joint committee that you've mentioned could look into that further as we go forward as well. Sorry, Sarah,
if I may, I would just add that Ofcom, we would expect Ofcom to publish its own research in this space. It's already does fairly regular research of its sort of under its existing powers. We would expect it to do more in this space and make that publicly available, in addition, obviously, to the Secretary of State's, what the Secretary of State has been saying about the transparency and information gathering powers.
That'd be incredibly welcome. And finally, because it was mentioned earlier, so not so much a trailer, but I know that anonymity was something that wanted to be discussed, which I think has definitely come up within this within our witness statements very regularly, actually. And I think there's different schools of thought that have come up. One is that, do you have complete anonymity because that protects whistleblowers? Do you have an element of anonymity which you could call traceability, in which case actually there's a known individual, but actually they can use whatever name and profile they want? Or do you have absolute, continue anonymity as it stands now? I just wondered where your thoughts were with regard to this bill, because my take is that I think the statement so far seemed traceability seems like the best of those three options. But I wondered what your take was on that, please.
So, first of all, I think it's important to say this bill will end anonymous abuse, because it will end all abuse. Whether it's by Joe who isn't really Joe, or Sally who isn't really Sally, it will end all abuse. But I think it's important to say that anonymity online is important for some groups and some individuals. Afghan refugees, people who are in this country for various reasons who legitimately and are working and need anonymity, whistleblowers, domestic abuse victims. There are many groups that do go online and need anonymity. So I don't think we can ban anonymity, but we're looking at ways, and this is something else we're already looking at, and I don't know if you're doing recommendations on this or not yet, but we're looking at ways that we might go further in allowing people to choose whether or not they can see anonymous accounts. So I don't know if you noticed, but recently the FA are providing guidance to their own football players on how they apply filters so that they don't see racist abuse or abuse with keywords in it. We're looking at how that can be applied so that people don't see anonymous accounts. And that traceability is key in that. So we know that platforms know by someone's, there was a reason how and why that student who posted that vile tweet about me was traced down to a dorm room in Oxford University. So we know that the Twitter knew exactly who they were, where they were, what their IP address was, what their location was. We know they have this information already. So what we're looking at, and the way we want to go further, is that individuals can decide that they don't want to see anonymous accounts. So that's what we're doing on that. But we can't ban anonymity. There are lots of people who need that. And I know there are people who say you must. Interestingly, actually, there are civil libertarians saying to me, you need to ban all anonymous accounts. I don't think we do. What is under that anonymous account is actually the platforms knowing who those people are and us looking at ways we can stop people seeing those accounts.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would strongly endorse what the Secretary of State said about traceability. I think it is important that where law enforcement agencies need to find out who is behind the account, that they can do so
quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Firstly, not just in most cases, but in all cases. And secondly, quickly. I had a constituency case a couple of years ago where there's some terrible abuse of a family whose son had been brutally murdered, and there was some abuse being sent to the victim's sister, 17-year-old sister, via Snapchat. And to get Snapchat to reveal to the British police who was doing that, it was proving very, very difficult. It took a very long time. And eventually, Sajid Javid, who was Home Secretary at the time, ended up getting it sorted out by being able to phone the American Justice Minister to do it. And it should not be like that at all.
Thanks. No, I just want to stress it's important that we do re-emphasise this. People operating anonymously should not think they are untouchable and unfindable. We can and do find people through the Investigatory Powers Act and through the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. There are powers to do so, and of course on the dark web also we have an important investigatory capability. I think the key point is the one that Chris mentioned. It's about speed and ease, and there shouldn't be impediments to finding people in this way. I think there's also a further thing, which is sometimes the perception that when somebody is anonymous, it's difficult for law enforcement to track them down. I think probably actually impedes some complaints being made in the first place, and so it's all about that facilitation.
And can I ask one final, very quick question, which actually it's very quick because it's
very finally. It's become one of the expressions of this commission.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very final and quick because it's about immediacy. If you excuse the pun, one of the things that I'm very conscious of is that I think the expectation of when this bill comes in, if it comes in on a Monday and it's all law, by Tuesday all harmful content will disappear off the web or off social media. And the sense I get from this is actually it's going to take a bit of time, and even Ofcom said it's going to take some time. What's your sense of timescale? So say when this comes in, it becomes law, how long do you think it will take for platforms to put into place all the stuff that's needed to stop harmful content?
Well, the short answer to that is they have the stuff in place already. So, and I heard the evidence of Ofcom saying they think it's going to take 3 years. I'm afraid that's not the case. And the considerable funding they're about to receive and the work on risk assessment moving forward, horizon scanning, understanding what platforms are doing, where the risks are, that work's happening now. And as I said, Dean, platforms don't have to wait for this Act to come in. This Act is going to come in. Named individuals are going to be criminally liable. Huge fines. This Act gives us the powers to issue huge fines for Ofcom to seize equipment. So if I were running a platform now, I would be looking at my terms and conditions, looking at how my algorithms work, and I'd be putting in place what I needed to put in place now. I wouldn't be waiting for this bill to come law. So it's not going to take time. This bill will be up and running from day one. As soon as it receives royal assent, it will be up and running. Ofcom will be working. They'll be ready to go, and it will move from day one.
Fantastic. That's great to hear. Thank you, and thank you, Chair.